Star Wars fans, we need to talk. Now, you probably clicked on this because you saw the title of the video, and this is going to be a controversial video no matter what, because there's so many people divided on so many sides of what good Star Wars is or what bad Star Wars is. But I don't want this video to be super highly edited. I want this to kind of be a conversation, me spitballing and talking with all of you. I look forward to all your comments. Basically, since 1980, Star Wars has been a divisive franchise, to say the least. One of the great parts of the Star Wars fandom is also one of its weaker aspects. It's that we're so passionate. We love this franchise so much, and so many of us love it for so many different reasons that nothing is ever going to really unite us across the fandom. There are going to be very few things that make everybody happy. So is it time to just give the entire franchise a fresh start? No, I'm not saying remake the original movies or the prequels or remake anything for that matter. This is not going to be a call to remake Star Wars. There's no way to ever do that, and I think it's kind of sacrilege to ever suggest that. But in a lot of ways, Star Wars is in desperate need to embrace the kind of multiverse style of storytelling that a lot of franchises have picked up and go for a new timeline, something fresh and different than what we've been kind of trudging through the last 10 years or so, but really the last 40 years. And just like Star Wars always does, I do think a fresh start would call back to the old. I think it's about time. I think we should kind of go in the direction of adapting the Star Wars expanded universe to film and TV. As you can see behind me in almost every video, I am a massive fan of the Star Wars expanded universe and Star Wars books and comic books in general. I love the EU and what the EU has done for Star Wars. The EU is part of Star Wars. It's part of the fabric of Star Wars. And so when they turned Star Wars canon into a fresh start for the new films, I understood it. From a business perspective, from a filmmaking perspective, it's impossible to expect fans to know 40 plus years worth of Star Wars material in your new movies, right? It's never going to work. But because I'm a fan of the EU as well, I understood the outcry of frustration when the EU was shelved and doesn't get any new material outside of Old Republic expansions. And this video is not really a canon versus Legends video. It's not to say one is significantly better than the other, or it's not to say decanonize anything that Disney's done, because I think we should continue that universe. There's plenty of rich storytelling, and it's a different timeline. It's a different universe, and we can really differentiate ourselves from Legends. Instead of constantly having to worry about Legends coming back into canon, we can just tell the Legends stories in live action film. And due to the age of the actors and also where the sequel trilogy has taken the original trilogy characters, it's made it nearly impossible to figure out what's the next step. How do we tell their stories currently in the Disney reign of Star Wars? How do we give these characters life again? How do we bring them back to the franchise, those characters that so many people hold dear in the fundamental DNA of what Star Wars is? Recasting the original trilogy characters, I think more specifically Han, Luke, Leia, Lando, Wedge, those types of characters in an initiative to where you're trying to push the stories forward, where they're not beholden or tied to anything we've seen in the past other than the original 6 Star Wars movies. I think that's a lot easier to stomach as a fan. That's certainly more easy to stomach for me as a fan. If it was in a separate timeline, a new timeline, basically one that we decide to give full attention to, while still doing the canon timeline, we could still go back and tell stories, obviously Mandalorian and or new canon ideas, and bring things to canon. It would allow canon to have its own fresh start, something where it's not beholden to the past. It can really go for new and different things. But if you want something beholden to the past, if you want something that is trying to bring the stories to life that so many of us have enjoyed in the pages of Star Wars books over the last 40 years, the Legends timeline is perfect for that. So when I mention recasting, a lot of you guys might say, well, we already recasted in Solo a Star Wars story, and that's true. But if you are trying to start a new universe, the same way we reboot a superhero universe or James Bond or something, and you are trying to tell new stories with the same character, recast the way George Lucas originally cast Star Wars. We should find a trio of actors that work well together as Han, Luke, and Leia. They should be cast because of their chemistry. We should also find somebody that works as Lando for that aspect, and we should really hone in and tell stories with that chemistry in mind, because that's something that really made the original trilogy, as opposed to the prequels or the sequels. So doing that, I do think will bring back a bit of that spirit. We'll never be able to recapture the magic of Mark Hamill, Harrison Ford, and Carrie Fisher. That's just never going to happen. It's not. So as long as we want these stories told, we have to kind of accept a new group of people. And I do think it is easier to accept those new people if we are telling stories that are separate from having to connect it to the canon versions or the versions we see in the sequel trilogy. Now, when it comes to the prequel characters, that's a little trickier because obviously the prequel actors are younger. They can't play, young versions of Anakin or Obi-Wan or Padme, but they could play Anakin and Obi-Wan maybe Clone Wars era or post Revenge of the Sith if you wanted to go back and do that timeline. But I do think for this era, it would specifically be at the start, especially when you're adapting this stuff, there would be a focus on the post-Return of the Jedi timeline, the stuff that builds up to and through the Thrawn trilogy. The Thrawn trilogy would definitely be the ideal place to start, but being realistic, Disney with canon right now in The Mandalorian, they're building up to their own version of the Thrawn trilogy. So if this were to start anytime soon, which it's not, but if it were to start anytime soon, there'd be no way they would do the Thrawn trilogy because it would be another angle of something they're already doing right now. Now they could, if this universe doesn't start for 5-10 years, they could do that in the future, do a new version of the Thrawn trilogy. And obviously, since that's the first thing that started the 90s EU that almost everything piggybacked off of going into the 2000s and the 2010s, that would be the ideal place to start. But let's say they actually thought this idea was good and they wanted to start it soon. They wanted a refresh for original Star Wars feel, a refresh to Star Wars Legends, to use these things as source material to adapt. Then the ideal place to start really would be the Jedi Academy trilogy. It's something we haven't seen in Disney's version of Star Wars. We haven't seen in Star Wars canon. It is something fresh and new under this reign. It would be something that the audience wouldn't have anything to connect it to in film or television before. We could introduce the Solo children a bit later and really go in on that family aspect of the Star Wars EU. I do think there are a couple other places that you could start this universe. The other one would be Young Jedi Knights. You can introduce the Solo kids. If you don't want to go down the rabbit hole of having to recast the entire original trilogy crew, immediately you could just focus on Luke for a while, or slowly bring our adaptations of these characters into the story while getting us attached to the characters that are going to take us through a lot of this story, the Jasons and Janas. Or the other way you could go is you can go with the X-Wing series. We know that Rogue Squadron is a movie that's kind of in development hell, but we know that Rogue Squadron is something they're interested in. Recast Wedge, cast Corran Horn, go with this story of Rogue Squadron reclaiming of Coruscant, and make Corran Horn a key character in this story, and then build him up to go into Jedi Academy, and then redo the iJedi story, tie it in to maybe Young Jedi Knights. That's another place you could start. And because there's so much material to pull from, if you do focus on pulling material from these books and comics, there should be a lot of writers brought on board, people from the EU. Obviously, book writers, they're not script writers. That's not the same medium, but they should be brought on board as a consultant. And I think that's the big part of this initiative. If Disney wanted a fresh start, if Lucasfilm wants a fresh start, you bring in writers, you shape this universe, you shape the arcs of this universe based on pre-existing material, but you shape how you want to tell the stories, which ones are important. Maybe you axe the Callista trilogy, like I would very much want them to not do the Callista trilogy, but you keep the things that are important, you plan out and structure your arcs for these characters. When do you age them up? When do you progress the narrative into the future? The EU covers so much time, and even the 90s era of the EU covers almost 20 years worth of time before you get to New Jedi Order. You can't really include them all, right? So planning it out is essential, it's key, and it would allow them for some redemption from not planning out the sequel trilogy originally. So I've also divided this into the good and the bad. What would be the outcomes of having an initiative like this? And we'll start, as always, with the good. The good is what we like to focus on this channel. I think this would be an olive branch to the fandom. It's an attempt to give credit and acknowledge stuff that the fandom loved for 30 years before Disney acquired Star Wars. This is a thing that we're actually going to mine from and pull big stories and big arcs for our biggest projects, not just little nods or winks, or not just a character here and there. This is going to be the source material for a whole other side of the Star Wars universe. I think that's really cool. It's a nice way of at least trying to bridge that divide that seems to be there from creatives and fans. Another positive is it does give casual fans a chance to get caught up with the EU. The EU is so expansive, it's almost impossible to read, watch, and play every book, comic, video game, short story. There's also the possibility of new stories. Now, I know a lot of us want to see our stories adapted, or there are a lot of you who are like, please don't touch any of the EU stories with a 10-foot pole. You can't do them right. And that's fair as well. But if this does go right, if it goes right, we're in the goods section. If this goes right, then we have new material we can add. We can tell new stories that we haven't seen, but we could build them in the vein of the EU. Like I said, bring on these EU writers. Most of them are still alive, still around. There have been Star Wars authors who have been heavily a part of canon. I mean, Timothy Zahn's work in canon on Thrawn, a lot of you who say you don't like canon Thrawn, his work on Thrawn in canon has been excellent. But this would allow for new stories that build off the back of the EU, whether it's in books or comics or video games to continue, Knights of the Old Republic 3 or something to actually happen, or KOTOR remake to stay Legends. Those types of things would be able to exist now if we're going to give credence to this Legends universe, this Legends timeline, and keep it evolving and changing and growing. And it would also allow for some things from the EU that you might not normally get to see come back, and we get a new version, like kind of the version that the stories were always meant to be told in. I think specifically about Death Troopers. Like a Death Troopers movie would be amazing. There's no way it fits into the more grounded version of canon Star Wars, but had that like Legends tag on it. I do think would be something they could do and not think of it as this kind of mainstream Star Wars movie, but this offshoot Star Wars movie. There's a lot of room for interesting, varied storytelling that might not normally fit in the traditional Star Wars canon universe they're building right now. So those are a lot of the goods. Let's talk about some of the bad. If the movies and shows and animations, if all of it absolutely suck, or even are just mediocre, especially to start off right off the bat, then the vitriol around this will be way worse than anything we have seen before, because people will be saying they've ruined stories they love. Now, those books will still be there. We can still enjoy the books. That's why I've always been somebody who's pro adaptation, because we still have the original source material. It doesn't change. It's still there. You can still read the book. But if they suck, you know, that's kind of our one chance, and it's over. So it has to be good. They have to get it right the first time. The second con here is unrealistic expectations. The fandom will try to find a way to hate this, and so you do have to make it so good that people actually can't, which in a lot of ways is impossible. If we're willing to look at it as an attempt, I think it can work. But if people are going to have these expectations that things will just always suck and they're gonna hate it no matter what, then it's gonna fall flat on its face, and they'll never attempt anything like this again. And things will be cut. You're gonna have to cut things for time. If you change a book into a film, you have to cut scenes, but the same core story. If we're able to get that, then we have to be okay with the minor things that might be cut out of the books. One of the other problems with adapting material too is we know how the stories end, but the same can be said about most book adaptations that people have watched and loved. Even if we know the ending, I think it still would be worth that adaptation. I just don't want them to fully replace original stories. But a lot of this would require Lucasfilm to basically admit that things aren't going as well as they had hoped, which is difficult for us as individuals. It's definitely difficult for a billion-dollar movie studio, but sometimes that's effective. It's a way to reach back out to your fans and say, hey, look, we made some mistakes. We're not going to deny that. We're not going to try to hide that we've made some mistakes, but we want to put our best foot forward. We want you guys to enjoy the content that we're creating. We want that connection from the fan base to the filmmakers. We want to feel that love and support. We want to feel like everything we make is for you, for an audience to truly love and embrace, and not have this violent, hateful discourse that I absolutely despise online about different projects. Every project that comes out has to be something that's controversial. It doesn't. And this is a way of trying to reunite the entire fandom, reunite the creatives. I think that would go a long way with a lot of us fans. So what do you guys think about this idea? Do you think we should start fresh, go with a third timeline that's inspired by the events of the EU, or should we just make this a part of the EU timeline? Make sure you like the video if you haven't. Subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.